Living Transplant is a podcast that takes you behind the scenes of the transplant program at Toronto General Hospital, with the goal to educate, inspire, and fuel your passion about transplant. I'm your host, Candice Coghlan. Thanks for joining us for Season 4. In this episode, I sat down with Darryl Wallis, who spoke to me about his journey with hollow visceral myopathy, which caused him to grow up being unable to eat and living in and out of hospitals. He and his family had to wait for the science to catch up for him to have a multi-organ transplant, including a liver, bowel, stomach, and pancreas, which gave him his life back. A few years ago, Darryl's son was diagnosed with the same disease and received a multi-organ transplant, which was performed by Darryl's surgeon, Dr. Anand Ghanekar. Dr. Ghanekar, whose practice focuses on abdominal organ transplantation, joins us to discuss the rarity of multi-organ transplants, innovations in organ preservation and stem cells. He speaks about the privilege it is to have the opportunity to restore somebody from certain death to almost a normal life, and the personal connection he has to the success of his patients. Please enjoy. Welcome back to the Living Transplant podcast. Today, I am very happy to welcome Darryl Wallis to our podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, no problem. It's great to be here.
Awesome. So I'm wondering if you can tell our listeners a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I'm 37 years old. I just turned 37 a couple of weeks ago. About 16 years ago, I had a multi-organ transplant consisting of new liver, bowel, stomach, and pancreas. And now I'm living a normal, healthy life. I'm married, 2 kids, practicing pharmacist, and just kind of happy to be here, I guess.
So you talked a little bit about that transplant. I'm wondering if you can bring us back and talk to us a little bit about your journey with hollow visceral myopathy and how you were diagnosed and how this really began.
Around the age of 1-year-old, I was starting to have a few kind of strange symptoms. So I wasn't really gaining weight. I was having a lot of vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal distension, bloating, not exactly sure what was going on. So I'm from a relatively small town in Ontario called Sarnia. And the doctors here weren't exactly sure what was going on. So they sent us to London, where they had a bigger medical center. And there again, they weren't exactly sure what was going on, what was causing the symptoms. So they sent us to Toronto to Sick Kids Hospital. And similar kind of thing. They weren't exactly sure what was happening, did lots of testing, lots of different studies as far as, gastrointestinal transit and that type of thing, and essentially diagnosed me with what you mentioned earlier, which is hollow visceral myopathy, which basically means that my GI tract, including stomach, bowel, all of that did not A, absorb nutrients properly, and B, didn't move things through at an appropriate speed. And there wasn't, and still isn't really a cure for that. But the solution at the time, and much the same today, was putting me on total parenteral nutrition, or TPN. That's essentially just IV fluids and nutrition to bypass the internal organs and goes directly into the veins. And the plan at that time was, there is no cure for this. The only ultimate solution would be a transplant to replace the stomach and bowel. And essentially the doctors told my parents, we're just going to try to keep your son Darryl alive long enough so that we can successfully do those transplants. Because at the time, 36 years ago, they weren't really doing any transplants of that nature. Any attempts ended almost immediately in either organ rejection or the recipients passing away.
That's pretty scary.
Yeah. Especially for my parents. I'm the 4th of 4 children, so they had a lot to manage.
How did this affect you growing up with waiting basically on this treatment?
For me, in some ways, it was normal. It was kind of all I ever knew was hospital life, admissions to hospital, missing school, not being able to do exactly everything else that the other kids could do. There were years where I'd spend 20 or 30 days in a row at the hospital. That happened a number of different times. So as far as, growing up, it definitely had a big impact on my, say, normal, school life, work life, social life, those types of things. The biggest impact, I think, for me specifically was just not being able to eat. I spent 20 years from the age of 1 until I was about 20 when I had my transplant, essentially not being able to eat. And of course, in our culture, eating and everything around that is a big social aspect of life. So that was difficult for me. My parents generally did everything they could to make me, not deprive me of anything and make sure I was included in everything that all of my siblings were. So they still made me go to school every day. They still made me have a paper out. When we were eating dinner as a family, even if I wasn't physically eating, it was, yeah, you're coming to sit with us. We're all spending time together as a family. Going on vacation was difficult, but they always made sure that that was something that we could still all do as a family. When we were camping, for example, that might look like hooking an IV pole or an IV bag up to, a nail in the camper or a screw or, outside at the campfire, just arranging it on a tree branch. Like, they were very good at making sure that I had as normal upbringing as possible.
So, at what point through your journey did transplant come forth as a potential option, this multi-organ transplant?
It was always something that was kind of at the back of our mind, something that was going to be needed eventually. The concern with long-term TPN is that it tends to cause liver damage. And if that's left too long, it can lead to liver failure. And ultimately, that's what happened in my case. When I had my transplant, in sort of the end stages of liver failure. So it was always a balance of trying to delay the transplant as long as possible, while recognizing that, generally speaking, people who are waiting for organs can wait years before those organs become available. The risk of listing too early is that, let's say when I was 10 years old, the risk of the transplant was much higher than the risk of staying on TPN and those longer term risks. Along with that liver failure, you also have risks of IV line infections, bacterial infections. Generally speaking, bleeding is always going to be a risk with the central line. So it's weighing that balance of not waiting so long that you would die waiting for a transplant, while still waiting long enough that the transplants were becoming more successful. So I was 19 years old when I got listed on the transplant list. I was at school at the University of Toronto. And for me, I was on the transplant list for about a year, a little over a year prior to getting the call for the transplant. And at that point, there wasn't much of an option to say, no, we'll wait longer or anything of that nature. It was very much, if it doesn't happen now, the outcomes are not good.
And you mentioned being at university. You are now a pharmacist. Did what you went through, did that influence your career path?
I would say growing up the way that I did, which was essentially from the time I was a year old until I was 20 years old, I was hooked up to those IV feeds overnight for 17 to 18 hours a night, every night. And it wasn't until, maybe a year or two before my transplant where I could actually get a portable IV pump to be able to leave the house. Prior to that, it was very much hooked up to the IV pole, either in the house or in my room for those 16 to 17 hours, which gave me a lot of time to study and learn. And so I was always very interested in the medical field as well, having spent so much time around nurses, doctors, surgeons, anesthesiologists, pharmacists, all of that. And pharmacy was a pretty good fit for me because it allowed me, a little bit of the social aspect where you get to see the patients on a regular basis, but it allowed a fairly good work-life balance where most of the work is left at work. And it allowed me to, do something which involves things that I'm good at. So puzzle solving, patient interaction, optimizing medication regimens, and then having all of the experience, navigating the healthcare system and being in the hospital and knowing personally what that's like, I feel helps me really connect a little bit better with my patients and, meeting them where they are and helping them kind of navigate that journey as well gives me like an immense amount of satisfaction.
And what a good feeling for people who have you to rely on, that they know that, somebody has their best interests at heart and that they're really working towards making things better for the person and not just the combination on a paper, right?
Exactly.
That makes a big
For
difference.
sure. In healthcare, there is sometimes a focus on the problem or the disease or the specific infection and whatnot, and sometimes the actual patient, the actual person gets lost in that quest to find the answer. So keeping that person front and center is always beneficial, both to health outcomes and just like I said, meeting that person where they are and being able to see them as more than just their disease.
Absolutely. Going back to, you're in university, you're studying hard, you get this call. And what was that like? How did it feel to be told, hey, we have these 4 organs ready for you. It's time to come.
Yeah, so the call came really in the middle of the night, about 1:30 a.m. And it's kind of a difficult emotion to convey, I guess, because it's everything all at once. It's fear, it's apprehension, it's excitement, it's scary, right, to undergo this huge surgery with kind of an unknown healing period, B, an unknown outcome, but also there's that level of like, this is what I've been waiting 20 years for. This is the moment, So yeah, nervous excitement, I guess, would be the easiest way to describe it. At that time, I was, like I said, kind of in end stage liver failure, very jaundiced, extremely fatigued, having trouble physically getting to and from classes. So it's something I knew couldn't wait. It's something I knew was necessary, but still extremely scary. At that time, there were more successful transplants, and most of the patients were having better outcomes, and the technology and the knowledge base had come so far, over the previous 20 years, that I was confident in the surgeons, confident in the doctors, but still there's a level of uncertainty there for sure.
Yeah, that's huge, is to walk into something preparing yourself for the worst, but definitely hoping for the best and knowing that you're in good hands. And you were in good hands. The surgery was, as much as you could say, a success.
Yeah, the surgery itself went very well. Everything kind of fit in there as it was supposed to be. There were, I guess, some expected complications post-surgery. They had to go back in and, repair a few miscellaneous items over the following couple of weeks. I ended up being in the hospital for about 2 months post-surgery, which was a relatively good recovery time at that time. I went home. I was readmitted to the hospital about a month later with essentially fluid in and around my lungs from a leaky lymphatic duct, I guess. But that kind of resolved on its own with a couple months of TPN. And then since then, I've had a relatively complication-free period, which is, we're 16 years post-transplant now. So
how long after the surgery did you eventually stop using the TPN?
Yeah, so in the immediate post-surgical period, they kept me on TPN for a couple of weeks just to allow the organs to kind of settle and heal. And then they put in a G tube because I hadn't really been eating at all previously. So it was sort of a stepping stone, so to speak. And I had an ostomy as well. So that TPN to G tube feeds transition happened in those first couple of weeks. You start to feed the bowel slowly to make sure that everything is working properly. And then you can kind of ramp up those calories to a full diet. So I was on G tube feeds for just about a year post-transplant, had the ostomy reversed about 10 months post-transplant. And I was starting to eat a little bit in that kind of 6 to 12 month period, eat, normal food. About a year post-transplant, we were at that point where I don't get hungry. I didn't get hungry. I still don't physically get hungry, but there was no, I guess, physiological reason why I couldn't eat a whole diet by mouth instead of via the G tube. So the decision was made essentially just to kind of take out the G tube and hope for the best, almost.
And what was that like to start eating food?
Yeah, it was exciting. I can vividly recall, a time when I was probably 8 to 10 years old. It was likely around my birthday. I was likely in the hospital, and my mom asked me, if you could have anything you wanted, anything at all, what would it be? And my answer always was just, I want to be able to eat. Like, I didn't want travel. I didn't want, toys. I didn't want stuff. I just wanted to be able to eat. For me, that was the ultimate goal. That was normalcy in my eyes, was just being able to eat. Now, post-transplant, I was actually able to eat, and I was living in Toronto where there were, all of these multitudes of cuisines that I'd never been exposed to, never been able to try. It was an exciting time for sure, to be able to eat whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted, with, no concerns about any food getting stuck in my throat or vomiting or feeling unwell or, getting admitted to the hospital for X or Y reason because of something I ate. It was just freedom.
Yeah. Wow.
The ability just to not be tied down to anything. So after school, when I was younger, there wasn't an option to really, plan to go anywhere or do anything spontaneously. Everything had to be very regimented, planned, backup plans, emergency supplies, all of that. Whereas now, if my wife and I want to go away for the weekend, or if we want to take the kids somewhere, or if we want to travel, get in the car and just drive somewhere, that's something that for the most part we can do. I'm sure we'll talk more about my son Owen in a little bit, but as far as myself and my wife, the level of freedom is almost, it's almost laughable, the change between now and previously. Like just the amount of stuff that I can do if I want to. Freedom is just hard to describe. It's almost like night and day now versus pre-transplant. Like there's almost no way to adequately describe the level of change and like the monumental impact that it's had on my life from pre-transplant to post-transplant. I certainly had a good life pre-transplant. I was happy. I was, doing the things I like to do. But at that time, it's almost would have been unimaginable to look at what I'm doing now and see that as a possibility.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine what that was like to not have to have all of those backup plans, or to know exactly, in a very, very small example, for me, knowing when I was on dialysis, knowing where the closest hospital was, or knowing, making sure that I had certain things when I left the house. Now post-transplant, it's, do you have your little pack of pills with you? And that's it, right? You throw them in your backpack and off you go. And it's a very small thing for me compared to what you've been through. It must feel like you've had two lives almost, like your pre-transplant life and your post-transplant life. So your wife and you met during your freedom phase, I'll say. And you guys got married and you have two beautiful children together. At what point did you notice a change with your son Owen's health?
Probably about a year old. So prior to having Owen, I had tons of genetic testing, both sort of on a personal curiosity level and future planning level. Nobody in my family had anything like this. No uncles, aunts, grandparents, cousins, nothing like this had ever happened in my side of the family or Jamie's. It was very much like a question mark as to what led to it, what caused it. Was it genetic? As I said, I went to Mount Sinai, I had some genetic testing there, as well as at UHN at Toronto General. And there was no indication that it was genetically transmitted, my specific version at that time. And, around the 1 year mark when Owen was, just a baby, he seemed to be having similar symptoms to what my parents had described to me. So, he was a little bit distended, a little bit of vomiting, didn't seem to be eating as much as he could or should have been. Weight gain had sort of slowed. We saw a few doctors in Sarnia, doctors in London, and they were all sort of like, no, like it doesn't really look like, what you had. And then just kind of kept going. Eventually he went to sick kids, and at that time was much more distended and much more like my presentation. More genetic testing, etc., and eventually determined that there was a not necessarily a new gene, but one that's more associated with aortic dissections and aortic kind of widening, but also in rare cases has been associated with hollow visceral myopathy, and we both share that gene. So he was diagnosed around a year old, and when he was about 2 years old, he had an acute septic episode, and he lost his entire small bowel and most of his large bowel as well.
Knowing what you had been through yourself and, going through all of the hospitals and going through that medical world, how did you guys prepare for what was to come for Owen?
I wouldn't say it's something that you can ever really prepare for, as much as I kind of knew what it was like, and I maybe am a little more optimistic generally. It's different when it's your child instead of you. I know when I'm in pain or unhappy or doing things that I don't want to do, as an adult, I know how hard that is. As a child, it's that much harder. And as Owen's dad, it's one of those things where you can't help them the way you could if, they fall down and they scrape their knee. Those kinds of are difficult enough.
Did he have a very similar pathway that you did with treatment wise, with feeding and surgery?
Similar. So when he had his septic episode at age 2, at that time when they took out most of his bowel, they put in an ostomy and started him on TPN at that point. So in some ways, similar as far as timelines go. The difference for my case was that I had my entire bowel my whole life until my transplant, and that helped to mitigate some of the liver damage caused by the TPN. For him, with no bowel at all and no opportunity for nutrient absorption outside of the TPN and lacking that, internal organ system, he started showing, signs of liver disease a little bit earlier, because without his central line, he wouldn't be able to maintain hydration. He wouldn't be able to survive longer than a couple of days. The risks for him, longer term and shorter term, were much higher. He wouldn't have necessarily done better longer term without a transplant. So we made the decision around the age of 4 to list him for transplant. He was at that time, and even right up until his transplant, he was, healthy, happy, running, jumping. He never really stopped moving and never really stopped. He adapted extraordinarily well to, having that central line, having the ostomy. Hospital visits he doesn't necessarily enjoy, but Sick Kids Hospital does a great job at making the kids feel comfortable there. So yes, he's had his share of hospital admissions and uncomfortable procedures, but like I said earlier, I am very good at trusting the process, and he's very good at just being a kid. So he doesn't let a lot keep him down. If he has the option to get out of his hospital room and run around, like he's going to get out and run around with the IV pole, or he's going to pull out his line, right? So he's a
Right.
ball of energy for sure.
And then when he was listed, how long did it take until he received his transplant?
So for him as well, it was about a little over a year that he was on the transplant list. He just had his transplant in July of last year. So we're about 7 months post-transplant now. No major setbacks prior to transplant, aside from, like I said, you've got your typical hospital admissions. Line infections were still a concern. Not really being able to get the central line wet, and he had the G tube, so had to be a little bit careful at school and sports and that kind of stuff. He doesn't let anything keep him down, so he just thinks that he's able to do whatever he wants whenever he wants, and to some extent that's true. And yeah, he's just extremely resilient for sure.
So, what was the process like when you received the call that Owen's organs were there and that it was ready and it was time for his transplant as well?
A difficult decision, because if we had said no, this isn't the right time, or we think we'll wait, like there's no telling what tomorrow would bring, or next year. It could be 5 years before we get a call for another option. And that, with his disease and with the prognosis, like there's no telling, next week he could get a line infection and need the transplant then. And so regardless, for anyone waiting for organs, it's never an easy decision to, when you get that call, to say, yes, we're definitely going to do it. There's that apprehension of, are we making the right decision as parents? Are we putting him in a situation where, he could have a negative outcome, things could go poorly? But I just kind of look back to my hospital journey, and always trusting the process and trusting the doctors. And even for me, 16 years ago, the transplants were becoming more and more manageable, we'll say. And over the past 15 years, gone so much better. And the one thing he did have going for him is he was so healthy. He is so resilient. He is such a fighter. Like we weren't necessarily overly concerned about him coming out, with a positive outcome. It's just, you're never really sure what's going to happen. We knew it was the right decision, but it's still hard.
So he went through the process. He had the 4 organs transplanted as well, and it was a success as well.
Yes. So he was in the hospital as well for a couple of months post-transplant. There was some, setbacks as expected, blood work not looking exactly right. And, but as far as his physical recovery, he was, ready to be up and moving within a couple of weeks. And I think day 8, he was up out of bed, and, he didn't take long before he was back to his relatively normal, crazy self. And he's back home now. He just had a surgery to have his ostomy reversed, G-tube put in. So he's not on TPN anymore. He's starting to eat by mouth a lot more. He is still getting some G-tube feeds as well. But as far as progress, like he's hitting all of the landmarks that he's supposed to be hitting. He's doing everything he's supposed to be doing. He's due to go back to school next week. He's great and things like that. So we're trying to, much like you would, a baby just learning to eat, trying a little bit of food, a little bit of different things every day, just so he gets to learn what different tastes and textures and all of that are like.
Mm-hmm. Wow. It must be an interesting and joyful journey to re-experience food again through his eyes as well, that you got to go through that journey of the world opened with all of these foods and tastes, and now that's happening for Owen as well.
It's great to see. When he was younger, a year old and 2 years old, when he wasn't really eating, it's harder, right? Because you want, as a parent, to feel like you're feeding your child and giving them what they need. And he just didn't seem to either want to or be able to really eat any significant amounts of anything. And so now, sitting with him at the table, or, packing his lunch for school, and then when he gets home, asking him what he liked and what he didn't like, it's just fun.
So I'm wondering if you have any advice for families who are going through a process that, they have a child or a sibling or a parent who's living with chronic disease or has to go through this transplant process, of what you've learned through your journey and Owen's journey.
For a lot of medical families, us included, day to day, it's just hard. You've got hospital appointments, you've got restrictions on what you can do, where you can go, who you can see, gatherings. The pandemic has been difficult for a lot of people. And then, like I said, focusing on those positive moments. So, did I spend a lot of time in the hospital as a child? Yes. Does Owen now have a lot of hospital appointments? Yes. But there's people you meet at the hospital where, you have those connections with. There's, activities that he gets to do only at the hospital. There's volunteers there. There's moments of joy within, that kind of darkness, so to speak. And just focusing on that is important, because everybody, regardless of whether they live with chronic disease or, have lots of hospital admissions and all of that, everybody in life has moments where things are going well and moments where things are not going well. And just appreciating those times where things are going well, even if it's, something as simple as us and the kids going for ice cream. Like, it doesn't need to be a vacation in Hawaii. It doesn't need to be climbing Mount Kilimanjaro. Just taking time to appreciate the simple things in life.
Thank you. Is there anything else that you would like to share with the listeners that you think that we maybe didn't touch on?
Obviously, I'd like to promote the idea that organ donation is important, right? And I know, and most of our circle know that, the choice to donate your organs is a difficult one, but it's something that can have such a huge impact on the recipient. Yes, of course. But also their family, their friends, their community. It's the type of thing that, it's one small action, but that can snowball into, having huge impacts on the world as a whole. So for me, for example, I've now been a pharmacist for 13 years. And, throughout that, I've had the opportunity to help hundreds, thousands of people, on their individual health journeys, make them healthier and happier for their family and their friends. And so every positive experience that I've experienced or I've had a part in is solely due to that one organ donor. And when you factor in that one organ donor can help 8 different individuals, the amount of impact that can have is almost immeasurable. Especially for Owen, right? Like, I can't imagine what his donor's family kind of is going through and has gone through, and how difficult of a decision that was to make. It's just so incredibly generous at the most difficult time in most people's lives and families' lives. At the end of life, there's so much going on, and it's such a difficult time. And to be able to make that decision to donate those organs and to save lives, I'd like to think brings some level of comfort to those families as well.
It's so incredibly important. And so many Canadians agree with organ donation and agree with being organ donors, but they haven't registered their consent or talked to their families. So it's so important for people to hear journeys like yours and Owen's as well to see the actual impact of what organ donation can do. Because like you said, who knows how many lives have been touched because that donor decided to donate their organs to you. I might throw you under the bus here, Darryl. Why don't you introduce Dr. Ghanekar, because you have a connection?
This is Dr. Ghanekar. He did Owen's transplant surgery in July of last year. And then conveniently, he was also involved in my transplant, which was 16 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Welcome, Dr. Ghanekar. Dr. Ghanekar is also the Associate Professor of Surgery at the University of Toronto and Multi-Organ Transplant Program at the University Health Network. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Again, thanks for the invitation.
So I'm wondering if you could tell our listeners a little bit about yourself.
I'm an abdominal transplant surgeon. My practice is mainly focused in abdominal organ transplantation, mainly liver transplantation and kidney transplantation. I spend quite a bit of my time doing living donor operations, meaning procuring kidneys and parts of the liver from people who are willing to donate to somebody else. And I also do pediatric transplantation, mainly liver transplantation, and much less commonly intestinal transplantation, which is how I was involved in Darryl's case and Owen's operation more recently.
So I'm wondering, you talked about a couple different journeys you've been on as a surgeon. What led you to become a surgeon, and specifically in transplant?
Obviously, we spend quite a long time training in medicine, and we see have lots of different experiences. Although I enjoyed many things in medicine, I think surgical specialties offer us an opportunity to combine both medical knowledge as well as technical skills. And so that's what led me into surgery. And then once in surgery, I think I became excited about transplantation because it's quite unlike any other discipline. Often patients with organ failure are some of the sickest and most complex patients that we have in a hospital. And transplant surgery really provides quite a challenge in terms of trying to help people get better by bringing both quite cutting edge medical care, but also very demanding, technically complex procedures. Then we have the opportunity to restore somebody from certain death to almost a normal life, and that's very special. It's really a privilege also. It's probably the only field in medicine where we deal nowadays with such a precious resource, and that is in the form of donated organs, whether they're from a deceased donor or a living donor. There's no replacement for that.
Darryl and I talked about this, for us recipients, you're right. We go into that surgery on the verge of death for some of us. And within mere months, we're given this incredible new lease on life. And, Darryl talked about his freedom, that really, that organ donation provides us the ability to have these incredible new experiences and live life as a healthy person. And it's remarkable that journey for surgeons happens within a few hours, and it completely changes our lives. It's amazing.
Well, even though we do these operations all the time, I still find it pretty incredible,
Mm-hmm.
And have to pinch myself, when a kidney comes to life and starts making urine, and or a liver starts producing bile, and all the or the intestines, when we restore the blood flow and they start peristalsing and doing their thing. It's pretty amazing to see, and all of our predecessors have discovered or made so many advances to make this possible the way that we're able to do it today.
So I am a single organ recipient. I have a kidney transplant, and I'm wondering if you can discuss the aspects of surgery and care for multi-organ recipients, because I know the logistics behind doing a multi-organ transplant must be multiple teams and a lot of organization. And I was wondering if you could talk about what that's like to be part of a transplant with multi-organs.
Rarely we've had situations where we will retrieve a living donor kidney and a living and part of the liver from a separate living donor on the same day and implant both of those in a single recipient. They're not as complex as the kind of multi-organ transplant that Darryl and Owen received. And the reason for that is that what they had is multiple organs from a single donor, but they were all transplanted together. So as a single, what we call a cluster. So we didn't transplant the organs all in, like we didn't have 4 different organs separated and then put them all in separately. And that's something that's quite unusual because there are not that many people that require simultaneous transplantation of all of those abdominal organs. What makes this complex is a number of things. Often patients who require this type of transplant have had quite a lot of surgery before, because the conditions that necessitate this often have required them to have multiple abdominal operations before, and that can make doing the transplant surgery quite difficult. The other issue is that patients who need this type of transplant often wait for a long time because there aren't many donors, deceased donors, where all of these organs are in perfect condition at the same time, and where we can, things are optimized so that we can actually achieve this type of transplant in a relatively short period of time, because the intestine is relatively sensitive to what we call the cold ischemia time, or the time between when it's removed from the donor and when the blood flow is reestablished in the recipient. So if there's a donor, for example, in Vancouver, just the time involved would make it difficult to achieve that and get a good result. So often we have to have a donor that's relatively close by, and then again in perfect, where the organs are in perfect condition.
Mm-hmm. I have a couple questions for you about your research as well, but I'm wondering, Darryl, if you have any questions while we're chatting about the surgery and that kind of process.
One thing, I guess that my question is, do you as a surgeon feel like you have enough follow-up with your patients in, I guess, a personal level? Because I know you're there and you're doing the surgery and you get to see those organs start. I know with you and I, it's kind of special because you were involved in my surgery. And so now you're able to see me 16 years later, but more so in the context of Owen. So outside of that, do you follow up, or do you not spy on your patients, but do you get to know about your patients' outcomes from their surgery?
That's a great question. I always joke with patients that that the less they have to see of their surgeon, the better. Means they're doing really well. We keep very close track of how people are doing when they're in the hospital. Obviously, most surgical problems that are going to arise early, after in transplant surgery anyway. The kind of major surgical problems, if they're going to happen within the first few weeks of a transplant. And so we are quite attentive and keeping a close eye on things during that time. I do actually keep track of, who I actually, in my records, have a list of everybody I've done surgery on, And that's part of also just kind of an internal quality control as well. You may have noticed surgeons take things very personally. If something doesn't go well, it's our handiwork that was involved there, and it's not like prescribing a medication where the medication needs to do the work, or it's a very personal connection we have with our patients, and so we do get pretty invested in how things go after the surgery. That's part of what I think is different in surgery compared with some of the other types of medical specialties. Is a very deep and personal connection with patients once you've operated on them.
Yeah. Your actual hands have been part of what makes us better and what has healed us, and that's a very personal connection to have used your hands to have done something for us like that. So, there's a lot of incredible innovation that has come out of Sick Kids and UHN, and I'm wondering in your field if you can talk a little bit about that technology or any of that innovation, because as Darryl said, when he was diagnosed, it was kind of a wait until the technology catches up to have his transplants. Are there things that are going on right now at UHN that you're really excited about in that regard?
I think the way you could look at it is things that might bear fruit in the short term, and then there's things that are a bit, say, maybe 5 to 10 years off, and then things that might be decades in the future. To give you an example that's relevant for Darryl and Owen, years ago, the TPN, the intravenous feeding that patients with intestinal failure would receive was quite different than it is now. And, it was just tiny changes over time, new formulations. And what we've seen is that many of the old ways of delivering this were very hard on the liver. And so many patients with intestinal failure would eventually develop liver failure. And that was the main reason that they required multiple organ transplants. It wasn't because the liver failed by itself. It was because the liver failed as a result of the TPN. These days, it's very rare for us to see liver failure in patients who have intestinal failure, because there's been so many advances, small advances over time, in formulating these TPN solutions so that they're not as hard on the liver. So these days, we're doing far fewer multivisceral transplants because of TPN-related liver failure. I'd say in the next 5 years, there will likely be some major improvements in the way we're able to preserve organs, donated organs. So some new approaches that are being developed that are already being used in Europe, for example, which will likely be implemented in Canada and in North America, which should actually expand the availability or the ability to use some types of, particularly livers and potentially kidneys, that we currently don't use. And that may be a big step forward in terms of increasing the pool of organs available for transplant. I'd say in the kind of longer term, there's really a big push these days in cell therapy. So the idea of growing cells outside of the body, in a tissue culture that could be then infused into somebody to correct the pancreatic function, so for diabetes, for example, or liver function with hepatocytes now, but there's starting to potentially be some real clinical application of this, which might be on the horizon in the next decade, I'd say. And then beyond that, I think this idea of bioengineering organs is there. And that's kind of the next step after the cell therapies, is that if you can grow the cells, well, maybe you can put them into some sort of 3D printed scaffold or something like that. and then actually have a functioning organ. So I think those are kind of the pie in the sky things, but there are some concrete steps being made in those directions, which are very exciting.
That's a good answer that we wanted to hear.
It makes it all worth it. I can say it's just to see Darryl and see everything that he's accomplished. It's really inspiring.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ghanekar, for being on our episode today. We're so grateful for your time and everything that you do and everything that your team does. We wouldn't be here today without you. So thank you so much for being part of our life and being part of our episode today.
Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure.
And thank you so much, Darryl, for joining and talking about your journey and also Owen's and being so open and vulnerable with us today. We're very grateful for everything that you've shared and all of your incredible advocacy work with increasing awareness about organ donation. And we'll say it again, if you haven't registered your consent, please go to beadonor.ca, and you can always reach out to us as well if you have any questions or fears about that process, because there's a lot of us who would be very happy and excited to talk to you about that. So thank you so much, Darryl.
Thanks.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Living Transplant podcast. If you did, please leave us a review and share with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to Living Transplant wherever you are listening today. If you have any ideas for podcast episodes, you can reach out to us at livingorgandonation@uhn.ca or on social at GiveLifeUHN. For more information about living organ donation, you can visit us at www.livingorgandonation.ca. Special thanks to Lead Podcasting for editing this episode and for production support. Thanks to Paula Neves, our advisor to the show. I'm your host, Candice Coghlan. Thanks for spending your time with us.